You are watching LiterJay.
LiterJay for the real world wide hood star.
Pastor 2 liter for the real world wide hood star.
Pastor 2LiterJay for the real world wide hood star.
Hello there. Welcome to our Shield of the Sun video. This video is entitled The Babalon Working. So in this video, we're going to talk about a particular person. His name is Jack Parsons. And we're going to talk about his connection with L. Ron Hubbard and L. Ron Hubbard's connection with one noted named Aleister Crowley, and how all of these three men had a lot to do with certain experiments that even ties in with the 1947 Roswell incident took place in Roswell, New Mexico, when then outside the region of Roswell, where the first crash site was located. Now, what is interesting about all of this is that a lot of people know the story of Roswell, and if you watch the video also about the silencing of Roswell, you'll also learn about how extensive and horrible the cover-up was, and how deep that rabbit hole truly went in regards to that incident, how it ties into a lot of incidents that took place after, even some being before it, and incidences that still continue to take place, and the cover-up still persists on to this day, being done in different and various ways now. But what we have with the Roswell incident is that it was an incident that wasn't an accident. And it wasn't an incident that involved a message from beings in other galaxies. In fact, people who teach that kind of thing really need to repent before the Lord. So with that being stated, it doesn't entail a happenstance, if you will. But what if you came to understand that it was planned, it was initialized, and it had a ritual aspect to it? So the story is, a lot of people who came to understand more about this particular subject nature of Jack Parsons, his interest in the occult, his interest in Ron Hubbard, his interest with Aleister Crowley, had a lot to do with an experiment Jack Parsons is believed to have taken part in. This experiment had a name, and it was dubbed within the occult the Babalon Working. And within the Babalon Working, to understand what that is, it pertains to rituals of Thelema. And the rituals of Thelema were detailed and described by Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley was dubbed by the government of Sicily at the time as the wickedest man on earth. He initialized an occult that persists of sex magic rituals, a lot of this taking place in Sicily, where he earned his infamy. There, he had a group of families there, and he initialized these sex magic rituals. This entailed the molestation of children, animal, and even human sacrifices, deep and occultic, blood-driven rituals that entailed many, many pagan rituals to be ingrained with it. And before he became this infamous person, he had wrote a book in the early 1900s called the Book of the Law. And while he was engaged in deep satanic ancient Egyptian worship, he encountered a demonic being he called Lamb, which had the same appearance as what alien believers call aliens. This demonic being actually instructed him on the New Age faith and its agenda and all of its rituals. Have you ever wondered why Hollywood is so messed up? Why it's engaged in so many secret societies? Why it has pedophilic rings? Why it engages in horrible demonic activity? You ever wonder why politicians can be so messed up? You ever wondered why the elitists are so messed up? Rothschilds, Rockefellers, the 13 bloodline families, the Midwigorian family. You ever wonder why people within powerful secret societies that have an influence all around the world, you ever wondered why Freemasonry and Masonic members are engaged in such satanic rituals that involves sodomy, that involves blood drinking, that involves pagan venerated ceremonies, and animal and even human sacrifices? Why these parameters goes on why members of the Church of Satan engage such things through hidden ways, and they are so popular and so influential behind the scenes in Hollywood. Where does all of their ideas come from? It could be an important question. Why are they so transfixed on hurting children, on drinking blood, on engaging in disturbing acts? Why are there hidden messages in entertainment, music, and even movies and commercials? Why is there subconscious messages in them? Why do they put such things in their music, their products, and things of this sort? Well, the answer comes in this book known as the Book of the Law. In fact, Aleister Crowley and his teachings are a primary reason why Hollywood and politicians and economic fields and corporation fields, their hidden world is so messed up. He is a very huge factor of that, a primary factor of that, in fact. What's been often seen is the parameters of hidden elitists and their crimes. People who work in the world behind the scenes. Their crimes, if you put a methodology to them, if you put an investigative understanding into why they're done, it matches the methodology and understanding that's seen in the ideology and the doctrinal teachings of the Book of the Law, written by Aleister Crowley. Now, Aleister Crowley taught that sodomy, the molestation of children, and offering human sacrifices could give persons real power in this world. It gives persons abilities that could induce putting people into trance, hypnotic, and inspirational states, wherein they would teach the New Age faith through the forms that Lucifer was noted for. See, Satan, Lucifer, the fallen cherubim angel, he was noted for influencing the other angels through forms of entertainment, through the merchandise of his skills. And thus, the Book of the Law was teaching just how to do that and how to gain power through these various fallen angels in order to initialize, to do their will upon the earth. And hence, that's what Do What Thou Will was all about. It wasn't the will of a person. It was the will of Satan, who teaches that all persons can be their own God. And this entails thus rebelling against the rules of God, which therefore would keep them as servants of Satan. See, he also taught his followers to talk backwards. He also taught them to put backward messages in their products, even subliminal messages. He taught his followers to do venerated rituals and ceremonies that would even entail sacrificing loved ones and family members and things of this sort. He taught these things as venerated ceremony, as to honor the God of this world. And thus what you had in the 20th century going into the 21st was that the most powerful secret societies throughout those generations adapted the Book of the Law as their primary blueprint, as the true source of information that attains power for them. And it was so wicked and evil that we can see that everything about Aleister Crowley speaks for itself. This is why he's so controversial. This is why they don't discuss the Book of the Law. This is why law enforcement, even at the highest level, is not quick to connect that all of these bad activities are connected to the beliefs that were written in the Book of the Law. But in fact, they actually are. So with that being stated, that's who Aleister Crowley was. Now, Aleister Crowley was noted for engaging in a lot of various rituals. A lot of these rituals were even taught in the Book of the Law. One of them was the opening of demonic portals. He talked about making holes in the space-time streams that lies in the atmosphere. He talked about through enough human sacrifices, enough generation of demonic energy, that dark matter, that energy, aligned with the system of their ceremony, can open up a portal, and it can allow demonic beings to come through. These demonic beings who would appear like what is classified by alien believers as aliens, but is actually described in the Bible as a legion of the fallen host, the Nephilim, who come, even in many of them, in ships and in other designs, organic and tangible technology, but it's metamorphosized and it's on a supernatural level. Aleister Crowley understood all this. Governments of the earth understood all this and were very, very interested in that technological part. They wanted advanced knowledge. They wanted to make and repackage advanced technology. The Babalon Working was believed to have been initialized by Aleister Crowley in support and in funding of various other governments. It's believed he performed rituals for the British Empire, for Russia, for other nations as well, secretively, to such an extent that many times other nations he worked with could not trust him because of the other connections that he had. Aleister Crowley had been all around the world, conducting rituals for various elitists all around the world, and their primary interest was always this Babalon Working. Because what it was said was that these elitists would gain information, advanced technology through some of the happenstance occurrences that took place when they would have Aleister Crowley engage it. Aleister Crowley also taught his followers how to do it themselves. Many of them came to understand that its complexities lied even in science, and thus a lot of people who were engaged in chemical and rocket science and other types of scientific fields who had occult leanings also wanted to extensively learn the sorcery and magic of Aleister Crowley, because they felt it would make them an even better scientist to incorporate their scientific inventions using dabs of supernatural knowledge, and hence why they got an interest in Aleister Crowley. Now, L. Hubbard was an individual, as you know. He is believed to have worked within military intelligence departments, and he had a high interest in Aleister Crowley's works. In fact, L. Hubbard believed one day that he was going to establish a church for the Antichrist and that he was a representative or the heir of Aleister Crowley. Some believed him, some didn't, but this is what he actually believed. And as we know, he did go on to found Scientology, so he did fulfill that part that he told people, but where did he learn such information from? Well, it is believed that L. Hubbard learned much of his leanings from Aleister Crowley. And through that relationship, there was another person who also had a high interest in Aleister Crowley. This person was Jack Parsons. Now, what's interesting about Jack Parsons is that this was a person who is believed to be one of the most brilliant rocket scientists to ever live. And in fact, much of Jack Parsons he was noted as this. He was noted as the occult rocket scientist. He is also known as the mad scientist. He was a person engaged in science and magic. Jack Parsons' primary interest was as such. Parsons was interested and practiced occult forms of sexual perversions, necromancy, the channeling of demons. He called it intellectual channeling. He was noted for wearing a white lab coat during the day, and then a black robe at night as he practiced science and sorcery intermingled within his particular efforts and function. Jack Parsons was somebody who was even open about a lot of his beliefs, and he expressed a lot of interest in the rituals of Thelema. And Jack Parsons, while studying the rituals of Thelema, he came to this revelation of his own. He thought he could use his technology, his way of building rockets, to literally smash some of the particles of the atmosphere to pierce through a hole, through space and time, through the circuits that are seen within our atmosphere, and thus opening up a portal. But he wanted to be not only effective in the way he opened up a portal, he wanted to do it as if he can just fire it into it and then just blow it right out, meaning rip it by force. But he felt he was going to need a lot of powerful energy to do that. He was going to need another substance with it. So while incorporating his scientific knowledge, he was also engaged in channeling. He was also engaged in ritual ceremonies as well. But he wanted to get better at it. So Jack Parsons was also somebody who built up a career. And this was somebody who was also young at the time as well. Now, the career he built up, the bulk of Jack Parsons' work, was in California, where he worked for several universities and seemingly coming to those universities out of nowhere. and eventually began to work for secret military projects. And this involved the making of rockets, where during that time, that is when he met L. Ron Hubbard. Now Hubbard, also working in military intelligence at that time, unofficially in many ways, he was also a noted follower, as you know, of Aleister Crowley. And he was a devout student, and he believed his purpose in life, as you know, was to advance the efforts of the Antichrist and one day build him a church. These beliefs of L. Ron Hubbard he shared with Jack Parsons, as the two were mutually working within various classified and controversial black projects for the United States government. Now, Jack Parsons at the time wanted to make a weapon. He wanted to make a particular invention, a particular rocket fuel that would initialize even the opening of a demonic portal. Now, his particular beliefs were openly considered to be crazy. This is where he got the terminology mad scientist from. A lot of people just looked at his beliefs as he was just nuts. This guy's just kind of out of his mind. Yeah, he makes good rockets, but this guy's got other problems. However, there were people in government that took him quite seriously and even took him up on that particular offer. Now, that's what was believed. So now Jack Parsons, basically, during the 1940s, we're into the mid-1940s, he wanted to get closer in touch with Aleister Crowley. He wanted to learn the accurate formulation of the Babalon Working. And thus, he went to his buddy L. Ron Hubbard to communicate that desire to Aleister Crowley, where L. Ron Hubbard is believed to have had some kind of radio communication with Aleister Crowley. So, what starts to take place within that is that Parsons wanted to successfully understand the Babalon Working, and as L. Ron Hubbard was in communication, as these two men were helping the efforts of Satan, as the efforts of the Babalon Working was to advance military projects for the United States government, and it was also to incorporate knowledge of this particular function as a way to understand what they dubbed as the alien menace better, and to also get better military advantage over the nations, particularly the Soviet Union and things of the sort. So what happened is that Parsons in 1943, he would co-found the Jet Propulsion Laboratory that later worked co-jointly with the Army Air Force, which eventually became the Air Force Base noted in White Sands, New Mexico. So in White Sands, New Mexico, certain things were about to take place, and these were starting to take place for certain reasons. So the reasons were basically this. Jack Parsons cultivated his work with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and then continued to engage in other classified work, some of this work being initialized in White Sands, New Mexico. A lot of that work was then taken over by the Air Force Base near there, and thus several laboratories were built involving the uses of science and black magic. So Jack Parsons' work had a lot to do with the function of these laboratories, which are with us today. Now what happened is the key point, is this. There was believed that an experiment had taken place in White Sands, New Mexico, right before what became the Roswell incident, meaning right before the discovery of the first crash. See, right before the discovery of the first crash, you may have noted that there was a massive thunderstorm that took place. And this thunderstorm came really out of nowhere, and it was very dangerous. The entire atmosphere looked very much lit up with energy, because it was filled with energy. In fact, it was energy that was ripping a hole at the time. This ripping of the hole was actually masterminded by Jack Parsons, L. Ron Hubbard, and Aleister Crowley. It is believed that Aleister Crowley gave L. Ron Hubbard the accurate information that Jack Parsons could use in order for him to initialize his own ritual experiment using the type of rocket fuel that he had concocted. When this experiment was implemented, what happened was the atmosphere was believed to have been lit up. And when it lit up, they were successful at opening up a hole, a portal. And when this portal was opened up, things came out of it. These things lied all over the field outside of Roswell and along at a second crash site. This whole experiment, believed to have first been conducted in White Sands, but the results of the project unfolded outside of Roswell. What they wanted to do was that after the incident, when the discovery of the first crash was discovered, That is when they wanted to bury the entire incident up. They wanted to cover it up completely. But you see, Roswell got leaked. You see, too many people knew what actually happened, and this is why the cover-up became so intense. Other incidences would follow as well, particularly the incident in Antarctica and the deals that were made through that mission of Operation High Jump. Thus, the cover-up policy was being initialized to quite a degree indeed. So, what happens? Following things start to happen. L. Ron Hubbard starts to become more distant from Jack Parsons and becomes more distant from Aleister Crowley, meaning he cuts off communication. Now, Aleister Crowley, on December 1st, 1947, months after the Roswell incident, he dies. He dies pretty much an impoverished, broken, heroin-addicted, demon-possessed man. I don't need to say anything more about his soul. And what happens with that is that a lot of information starts to be suppressed. Information that pertained to Crowley, people like Hitler, people like Jack Parsons, the scientists, the German scientists, Operation Paperclip, all of these things start to become suppressed, to the point that by the early 1950s, only very few people were left who understood in detail the events that took place in the 1940s, and many of them were very much committed with the government. The government, at least at that time, could trust they could be quiet about it. But one person they were concerned about was Jack Parsons. See, Jack Parsons had a way of being open in life. He was an open occultist. He didn't mind being called the mad scientist. He didn't mind that photographs were taken of him in black robes, and he didn't mind the fact that his co-workers knew he slept in coffins at night. But you see, Jack Parsons had some real info and some real activity. So what takes place with Jack Parsons is, on June 17th, 1952, Jack Parsons, who was 37 years old at the time, was working on one of his many famous chemical concoctions for rocket fuel technology. And one day, while working on this fuel, it is believed that just out of nowhere, it just happened, there was a massive explosion that took place in the laboratory, and that explosion killed Jack Parsons during the year of 1952. And what's so interesting about that is that investigations come to a lot of conclusions indeed. It's not that it's fully set in stone that it was an accident. It is believed that someone caused the explosion. Was that someone Jack Parsons? Or was it just a scientist who fell over his foot and he knocked over some wrong vial? Or maybe Jack Parsons could have had a confrontation. Some people, believed to be government people, military intelligence department people, MJ-12-like people, didn't quite like maybe what Jack Parsons was saying, or maybe the open lifestyle he led was just a little too much, or maybe there was just a conversation that just went wrong and Jack needed to go. And they resolved it by setting up an explosion that would kill him. See, that's strongly believed also as well. Which one is it? Did the government kill Jack Parsons, the government of that time pertaining to the cover-up? Or did Jack Parsons die of an accident? Well, either way of which one you want to believe, the fact that he died so young in 1952 also suppressed the testimony that Jack Parsons would have had of this particular controversial project known as the Babalon Working, is believed to have taken place in New Mexico. Kind of makes you wonder indeed. In fact, stories that pertain to that particular nature, that tends to happen, unfortunately, quite often. With that, join me in a prayer. Lord Jesus, we pray, Lord, that someday the truth of the Bible be known to all of humanity, that alien deception and that cover-ups pertaining to this deception and the lies that are being told regarding it and the lives that are being taken over it. I pray, Lord, this all comes to an end. And I pray, Lord, that the light overshadow all knowledge. And I pray that the light burn out the darkness and the blinders in people's eyes. I pray, Lord, that the awakening may take place and that souls be saved, and to rescue those that are persecuted, afflicted, homeless, being held for ritual satanic abuse, And I pray, Lord, that the demonic policy seen from the first to the last be rebuked and all demons bind. In the name of the Father, in the name of the Son, in the name of the Holy Spirit. Amen. If you'd like to donate to Shield of the Sun, please go to www.gofundme.com. There you will find a page called Michael Herr Books and Education. There you can donate to that page, or you can send me something in the mail at the address where you can go to the direct link, where the link is in the description box below, as well as the address, which will take you there directly. We're very much a struggling ministry. I can very much use your support. I want to say God bless you to all, and I will see you soon.
Through from there. All right, so thank you very much, Paul.
Well, thanks everybody, first of all, in the midst of so many things going on, to consider that this is where it's at right now, and this is worth listening to, the Babalon Working. I consider the Babalon Working to be, for me, the most interesting, the most charismatic magical working of the 20th century, the most important one, and yet I'm aware of the fact that in strictly magical terms the whole thing can be termed a complete failure, a catastrophe even, and there's certainly a good case. For example, I believe this, that Crowley's workings in the Algerian desert with Victor Neuburg and the Enochian ethers, culminating in the legendary Choronzon working, are far more magically significant in many respects. They've produced an extraordinary corpus of work that's recorded in the vision and the voice, the culmination of the development of the thelemic system. And yet, I still feel that the combination of factors in the Babalon Working, the environment, the period of time, and above all, the cast of characters are what renders it legendary. Now that was my first thumb gesture. There we are, yeah, okay. So everything that I'm going to be coming up with today, or 98% of it, is all contained in my book, Aleister Crowley and the Inner Horrors, but there's two sections in there. There's one given over to the Babalon Working and to what I consider the Gnostic elements that emerge from it. But there's also a lengthy appendix on the mystery of L. Ron Hubbard's involvement. What I'm doing today is kind of mashing them together. I've got a lot of material to go over here, so we'll see how we go over the next hour or so. The summer of 1945, in the second chapter of the Book of the Law, Hadith says, "I am the flame that burns in every heart of man and in the core of every star. I am life and the giver of life, yet therefore is the knowledge of me, the knowledge of death." And these words to me are very evocative of the summer of 1945 and serve as a suitable introduction to our main character. Jack Parsons, I think it was Richard Metzger who called him the James Dean of the Occult. To some people he's a possible contender for the title coolest man of the 20th century. To other people he's just a complete failure. We can read all about him and his extraordinary life and the Babalon Working in these quite well-known books. Chances are a number of you will already be familiar with them. I heartily recommend reading them. I can tell you now that there's a copy of Strange Angel available right down here with Midian Books, and I saw earlier on in the window of Labyrinth in Glastonbury High Street, Sex and Rockets, if you're interested. When it comes to the details of the occult working, I'm not really going to go into that much detail. There's plenty been written about this, plenty been said about it already. Chances are some of you here right now in this room really know more about the technicalities than I do. That's not what I'm trying to convey here. There's also, and this was published when I was putting the finishing touches to my Crowley book, so I didn't read it at the time. Having read it, I think it's a great book on the life of Marjorie Cameron, but I don't think there's anything that I'd particularly change in my account. And you can of course check out this notorious biography of L. Ron Hubbard. I've put both of the covers in there just because I want to contrast one and the other, and I tend to think the paperback cover is pretty goddamn bad. But yeah, you can read all of these and they help set the scene, they help create an appreciation of the amazing cast of characters. But there's more to it than that. You know, Strange Angel does give a pretty good evocation of the Los Angeles of the 40s, but I would also say saturate yourself in a bit of gangster noir as well. You know, this is not necessarily a great film, The Black Dahlia, but the style of it, the costumes, the interior, the mood of it. I watched this only the other night, you know, people have slagged it off. I think it's absolutely great. And, you know, this is the classic work. I have a sense that in certain respects, the Babalon Working is a noir event. It's set against that backdrop. If you imagine people like Parsons and Hubbard walking about the Los Angeles of that period, you know, that time of sharp dressed suits, femme fatales, and danger and corruption in the background. You know, if you almost imagine Raymond Chandler writing all of this down, no novelist could ever have done justice or even conceived of something like the Babalon Working, and yet it comes out of that context. First and foremost, in the big wide world, if we've encountered Parsons at all, it's in what you could almost call his other identity of John Parsons, rocket scientist. This is what's a fairly well-known photograph dating from Halloween 1936, where he's working with his mates who go on to help found Caltech, testing out rockets and so forth. Now, this little scene has actually been considered to almost be the founding moment of Caltech, and there's a whole little strange ritual that at Halloween they create what they call a nativity scene. The bottom photograph is the mannequins that Caltech have put on display showing this scene and featuring Jack Parsons on the far right. That's quite extraordinary. In 1938, when he's only in his early 20s, Jack Parsons ends up testifying at a trial where a corrupt policeman is being arraigned for his role in an attempt to kill by a car bomb someone that was investigating the corruption in Los Angeles police at the time. And Jack impresses very much, because he's only 23 at the time. He builds a little replica of what he considers to be the bomb that has done the business and how it works. And his testimony is actually very important in getting this guy sent to jail. Now, remember what I say about the whole noir gangster backdrop. We'll come back to that right at the end, but it really does anchor Parsons and his life against that kind of backdrop, I feel. During the early part of the war, the rocket technology that Parsons was working with helps develop what's called, for short, JATO, which is Jet Assisted Takeoff, and this is one of the first tests of it in 1941. What basically it's all about is you put a little, a small rocket on the wings of a plane, and it helps it to lift off with less of a runway. Now, in combat situations on aircraft carriers, there are all sorts of applications of this which are very, very, very useful. And Jack and his mates got contracts, a hell of a lot of money starts coming in, and this enables him to have a kind of freedom of movement and behaviour that would not be otherwise possible. Inevitably, he's drawn to the burgeoning field of science fiction and hangs out. There's a Los Angeles science fantasy society created by a guy called Forrest Ackerman, who's quite well known. Here's a little snapshot of it about 1940, and you can, amongst all of these people, you got the likes of Robert Heinlein, Jack Williamson, who I'll talk about in a minute, Ray Bradbury, Ray Harryhausen. And into this kind of scenario also comes people like L. Ron Hubbard and Jack himself. And such is the interest in all of this that there comes a point where Jack starts hosting mini little gatherings of some of these kind of characters in the home that we'll soon discuss. One of the most interesting works that comes out of this group, and it's not well known in the normal reckoning of science fiction, is Darker Than You Think by Jack Williamson, which is in fact a story about werewolves, about lycanthropy. And we know that Jack Parsons was extremely taken by this book. He was extremely taken by this work of fiction. And Crowley, with whom Jack Parsons was in correspondence, his literary tastes were founded in the late 19th century, and he considered the sort of stuff that Jack was reading to be a right old load of crap. But in fact, the influence of this on his later thinking is extraordinary. And I made a point of reading this book, and I've read a lot of books on the basis of knowing somebody that I was interested in had read that book, and I've never ever had such a sense of looking over somebody's shoulder as I did when I read this. I really had the sense of looking over Jack Parsons' shoulder. It's interesting to get and to read. Now, you probably all know that Jack ended up living in this extraordinary mansion in Pasadena that was came to be called the Parsonage. And if you look in Sex and Rockets, there's a really grainy, not very good black and white photo of it. You know, he moved in I think 1942. And the sense of the whole area, you can't find very good photographs, but what I have found is this was next door. This was a mansion created by a guy called Bush, B-U-S-C-H. He was actually a beer magnate. He'd made all his money out of beer. And he creates this extraordinary place where there are some famous gardens. These gardens back onto where Jack Parsons was. When you hear all these stories about these wild parties in the back garden, they back straight onto this place. You know, it's the kind of environment that they're in. The full extent of these gardens was closed down in about 1938, but it was all still there. And when you hear about, some of the extraordinary goings on, their neighbours in this place were kind of aware of it, and some of the complaints that come in and so forth. It's like Crowley has his lairs, at Boleskine and the Abbey of Thelema. Well, Parsons has his absolutely extraordinary lair. And, we know that he went out of his way to fill the place with a really unusual cast of characters. On the one hand, you've got, a guy who'd been a cinema organist from the silent movie era. You've got a woman who'd been a fortune teller. She spent all day, dressed up like she was still a fortune teller out on the seafront somewhere. There's people that are milling about in there from the science fiction community. There's people that's milling about in there from the rocket science community. But upstairs in Jack's own room, his real burgeoning interests are starting to manifest, because he's connected up with the work of Aleister Crowley. He's become passionately attached to it, and at the time, the lodge of the OTO that was functioning in the area was the Agape Lodge, headed by Wilfred Smith. And you've got a little scene of him involved in the Gnostic Mass there. And this is a famous photograph of Smith and the priestess at the time, Regina Cole. And right from the word go, you can kind of see where things are maybe going, because Parsons' wife, Helen, ends up having an affair with Smith, going off with Smith, having a child with him. Parsons is hosting the OTO in essentially his bedroom. He's got a huge, great room. He's engaged in all sorts of magical activity. For those of you here that know what's involved in the Gnostic Mass, there was a period of time where Parsons is having a Gnostic Mass in his home every single day. Okay, and that's his bedroom, man, all right? So you imagine the kind of voltage that is building up there. He's also performing Crowley's Liber Samic. He's interested in witchcraft. He's interested in voodoo. He's interested in phenomenon because he's a scientist. He blows shit up. He likes to see results, manifestation. And people were already saying as early as 1944 that the upstairs room was severely haunted, that people would come upstairs and the hairs on their arms would stand up. They had to get the hell out of there because it scared the shit out of them. So that's a pretty unusual household that you've got there. Now, we've said that Parsons' wife has gone off with Wilfred Smith. Well, Parsons' wife had a sister. This is Sarah Northrop, generally known as Betty, and she becomes, in many respects, although she's kind of in the background, one of the most important parts of the whole Babalon working equation. You don't actually see these photos that often. This is Jack and Betty. They're all having quite a wild scene there. Betty's totally into Thelema. Jack espouses, free love, as it were. He's quite happy to go off, and all the secretaries at work, he's just working his way through them. He's encouraging Betty to do whatever the hell she wants, and they think they can handle it. And then this guy turns up on the scene in August 1945. The month of the 8 bomb, by the way, so again, I think it's quite interesting timing. Now, I find it really extraordinary, the mere mention of L. Ron Hubbard's name in Scientology seems to really press people's buns pretty goddamn badly. It's like if you wired somebody up, if you wired people up to some little device that could measure their emotional state, like an e-meter maybe, and you read out a few lists of names, Hitler, little bit of movement there, Stalin, little bit of movement there, Jimmy Savile, maybe a little bit more, and then L. Ron Hubbard, and then people just start going flipping bonkers. I hate that fucking shit, I hate that bastard, I hate fucking Scientology. And I think, that's kind of interesting. So these days we have a certain sense of Scientology and its associations. It's nearly 30 years since Hubbard died, and some of those associations are not necessarily that cool. This is infamous chairman of the board, David Miscavige. And we've probably all seen the South Park Scientology episode making a justifiable joke out of Xenu and so on. But there we are in 1945, and Hubbard turns up at the parsonage, and he seems to have got quite a spectacular CV. He has been a pilot, a bit of a daredevil. He's served in the Navy, although the details of that are very questionable. He has been a member of the Explorers Club. Again, quite what he's achieved, we don't know. But he comes in there, he's a pulp science fiction author, and he charms the birds out of the trees, and he tells everybody all these wild stories, and he becomes the centre of attention instantly. Now, it's kind of interesting, again, the whole scene in those days. Before Hubbard's turned up, we've already talked about Jack and the two girls, one of whom's gone off with Smith, and then he's got involved with Betty. L. Ron Hubbard, this is Robert Henline and his wife. They had a whole thing going on before Hubbard turned up. He was hanging out with the Henlines, and the story as it goes is that pretty much Robert Henline more or less begged Ron to fuck his wife, which is a bit kind of weird, but this is how these guys were living and hanging out, and this passed for normal. So in terms of what then happens when Ron turns up at the parsonage, this is another thing altogether. He almost immediately gets involved with Betty. Now, this really does push Jack's buttons, because he's, full of all this ethic, if you like, of free will, but he gets very, very upset about it. And in terms of the cinematic qualities of the scene, we know in this mansion that both Hubbard and Parsons were into fencing, and they're having these fencing matches in this huge great room in the mansion that is just filled with all this tension, all this sexual tension and anger and all the rest of it. And yet Ron and Jack are apparently getting on fantastically well, and Ron is being praised as the most thelemic person I've ever met in letters that Jack's writing to Crowley, so it's all pretty strange. Way, the whole of Babylon, whoa. We know that Parsons is tremendously dedicated. We've got to have a few Whore of Babylon pictures, really, haven't we? You know, I mean, what the hell's that? You know, you do Google image searches for the Whore of Babylon, and it just... the Jehovah's Witnesses will never let you down in this department. And this is, of course, you know, the depiction of Our Lady Babylon on the Thoth trump of lust. And bear in mind, Parsons is a rocket scientist. It's the summer of 1945, the A-bomb. He's wondering about the Aeon of Horus, and he figures that the force is completely blind, dependent upon the men and women in whom it manifests and who guide it. You know, its guidance now tends towards catastrophe, he said. And he says the catastrophic trend is due to our lack of understanding of our own natures. The hidden lusts and fears and hatreds resulting from the warping of the love urge which underlie the natures of all Western peoples have taken a homicidal and suicidal direction. So he figures that Babylon is necessary to redress the balance. And him and Ron start brainstorming that, you know, they could work out some magical working that will enable Babylon to incarnate physically in the world. That first of all, they'll bring a woman to them who is able to conceive Babylon and give birth to her. So we know the score, you know, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. They settle on a version of John Dee's, you know, Enochian magic to get the show on the road. This is kind of filtered through the Golden Dawn, through Crowley. You know, John Dee purists will probably sort of tell you that it's by no means the complete system they're working here, it's partial and whatever. There's a lot of weird stuff that goes on here. You know, they start off in January 1946, and it's a pretty strange scene because basically, you know, Jack's involved on a nightly basis in a lot of ferocious wanking over these sort of Enochian tablets and so on. Some of the time he's just holding on to it, some of the time he's just covering these parchments and all the rest of it. Ron apparently is hanging out watching, you know, they're playing some classical music, it's all a bit intense, it's all a bit weird. It's not everybody's bag, man, is it really? But, you know, maybe this cast of characters here today may be a bit more, you know, understanding and sympathetic towards this sort of malarkey. And then Marjorie Cameron appears, you know, red-haired, pretty charismatic and extraordinary. Seems to totally fit the bill of what they want and what they're after. Had an early life that immediately activates the archetype of the witch. You know, she's psychic, she's visionary, she's powerful, she's artistic, she's had a number of suicide attempts, she's developed a visionary capacity. And the minute she gets there, she takes it on board. She's willing to get involved. Now, what's extraordinary about this is that from later accounts, it's clear that nobody ever really even told her what they were doing. It was just a case of, all right, you know, her and Jack are just going to spend a couple of weeks in bed going for it, and she will just accept whatever is going on. You know, this essentially is what happens. And it's only later that she actually comes to understand what on earth they're doing. Jack goes out in the desert into the Mojave alone in February 46 to invoke Babylon, and comes back with this Liber 49, which he considers to be the fourth chapter of the Book of the Law. You know, I wouldn't necessarily buy that at all, but, you know, it's a pretty extraordinary text, there's no question about that. When he comes back, he discovers that, you know, Ron is saying he's had a vision of a savage and beautiful woman riding naked on a cat-like beast who's got an urgent message, you know, to convey. Now, it may well seem, you know, surely Ron is familiar by this stage with the tarot imagery, the lust card, and enough stuff from what Crowley writes about Babylon to just make this shit up in the manner that he seems to have made a lot of stuff up. And yet, when they knuckle down to it, they settle down, and Ron is the scryer, if you like. He comes up with this chilling message, chilling in the light of hindsight. She is flame of life, power of darkness. She destroys with a glance. She may take the soul. She feeds upon the death of men. Concentrate all force and being in Our Lady Babylon. Light a single flame on her altar, saying, flame is Our Lady, flame her hair, I am flame. Dedicate thy soul to her, for she shall absorb thee, and thou shalt become living flame before she incarnates. And Ron apparently at this stage is shaking and looking pretty not at all well, for it shall be through you alone and no one else can help in this endeavour. It is lonely, it is awful. And, you know, we'll see where that gets to. But what's interesting is they're following to a certain extent the template, the Enochian working, John Dee, Edward Kelly and so on. There comes a point, as many of you will know in the Enochian shenanigans, where it all goes a bit weird. The angels tell Kelly that they've got to share their wives between them, and then Kelly makes off with some money and so on. And that kind of echoes in what happens between these characters. Now, alongside the 1945 nuclear backdrop, if you like, to the Babalon working, there's another evocative set of influences that I think we can profitably cross-reference. Remember that by the end of 1945, you know, Ron and Jack are hatching plans for the Babalon working. In December 1945, one of the greatest ever discoveries of historical literature was made by a peasant at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, a stunning stash of Gnostic texts, and including items which had a lot of importance in the rehabilitation of Christianity's holy whore, if we can call her that, Mary Magdalene. And these works took decades to translate. Parsons would never even have been aware of it. And it's kind of intriguing that there is something that is synchronised in terms of the themes and what's involved. Now, Philip K. Dick, you know, we all know the name, we've probably read some of his books, best known for Blade Runner, Total Recall. In the mid-70s, he has this brainstorm that results in him having an experience where he sees a pink beam of light that beams into his head. He starts downloading all kinds of weird data. He believes himself to be simultaneously living in first century Rome. He starts getting all this information about the life of that time. And he writes this a huge, great document down, and he starts talking about this Gnostic view of the world, that the world's been created by a mad deity and is a prison, but a higher level of divinity in the form of Christ intervenes as living information that Philip K. Dick calls the plasmate, the Holy Spirit. And when it comes into contact with human consciousness, there's a kind of cross-bonding, and this hybrid homoplasmate is created. And this annexes, as Dick says, the mortal human permanently to the plasmate. This is what's called birth from above, or birth from the spirit. And this force is there in the early Gnosticism, and it gets closed down by the triumphant church, by the Roman Empire, and it goes into a sort of hibernation in the Nag Hammadi library. Now, when the Egyptian peasant who discovered this thing opened the first jar, there was like all this sparkly dust came off it. Now, you know, there's all sorts of obvious 3D explanations for this, but Dick feels that it's the plasmate stirring and entering back into consciousness again. And he figures that in 1974 it hits California. Well, it's a visionary idea, it's a wild idea, but it's a very compelling idea. I would venture to say it wasn't as late as 1974 that it hit California. I would say that, the genie was out of the bottle straight away in December 1945. I think it's incredible to think that the Babalon Working is being hatched and is occurring at the same time as Nag Hammadi. And, Jack Parsons wasn't particularly attuned to what you might call the Gnostic aspects of the thelemic current. Remember, the guy's had the Gnostic Mass performed in his own bedroom every single day for ages. And there's all sorts of things in the Babalon Working that echo this. So in Liber 49, the voice of Babylon, supposedly as Jack Parsons channels it, says, "I am the bride appointed. Come ye to the nuptials, come ye now. My joy is the joy of eternity, and my laughter is the drunken laughter of a harlot in the house of ecstasy. All your loves are sacred. Pledge them all to me." Now, the most famous Nag Hammadi material is generally known as Thunder Perfect Mind, and it's become increasingly well known in recent years. And for those of you that were here for the last conference who heard me talking about Jung and Abraxas and Thelema, I think there's some very interesting ugly in ruin. I am the union and the dissolution. Now, Parsons and Hubbard had run into trouble when they entered this Enochian zone where, in fact, Edward Kelly had encountered a female force, not unlike Babylon, in fact, and the words are attributed to her. "I'm the daughter of fortitude, and ravished every hour from my youth. For behold, I am understanding, and science dwelleth in me, and the heavens oppress me. They cover and desire me with infinite appetite, for none that are earthly have embraced me. For I am shadowed with the circle of the stars and covered with the morning clouds. My garments are from the beginning, and my dwelling place is in myself. I am deflowered, yet a virgin. I sanctify and am not sanctified. I am a harlot for such as ravish me, and a virgin with such as know me not." Now, as far as I'm concerned, this is all the same thing being expressed at the same time. And when it comes to the intention, behind the whole working, clearly the true will of Jack Parsons has connected to something that is beyond his conscious understanding, and all kinds of things are happening that he cannot even be aware of. The comparison, the synchronization of the material that's come out at Nag Hammadi about Mary Magdalene with Parsons' conception of Babylon is, in my opinion, extraordinary. But we know where it all goes. Parsons and Ron settle into this business partnership in which Jack puts up shed loads of money and Ron puts up scarcely anything, and he goes off to Florida to buy some boats that they're going to sell, but in fact it just turns to him and Betty having a right old laugh. Now, what's interesting is that they were actually captured pretty much right in the middle of all of this by a newspaper out in Florida that wrote a feature on Ron that pretty much could have been written by Ron himself. It's just full of all this archetypal Ron mythology. But we've actually got this snapshot of this exact period of time. Here are Ron and Betty, and this is how Scientology handle it. There's the Photoshop. This is now the part of the official biography of Ron in Scientology, and we'll come to hear that basically Ron prefers to write Betty out of the story. This is him in 1947, walking away from the whole scenario. But Marjorie Cameron and Jack, they become an item. This picture, I couldn't find, I think this is reversed, I think this is the wrong way round, but it's a wonderful picture and it shows you their connection. And yet, that wasn't all there was to it. You know, when people think of the Babalon Working, that's the complete story of the magic of Parsons. But in fact, there's a part two. There's more to come in this. In Halloween 1948, he has another encounter with Babalon in some sort of dream, who tells him that he's got to go off on a black pilgrimage past desolate places and cyclopean ruins, and come at last to the city of Chorazin, and there to a great tower of black basalt, you know, part of a castle over the Gulf of Stars. Now, this is a place that's mentioned briefly in the Bible. It was cursed by Jesus for some reason. I think researchers have traced Parsons' belief that the Antichrist would be born there to an M.R. James story, where the phrase black pilgrimage, by the way, also occurs. And it's said in Liber 49, take the black pilgrimage. And as a result of this, he swears the oath of the abyss, having only the choice between madness, suicide and that oath. You know, he took the oath of a Magister Templar, the oath of Antichrist. Now, this is always kind of, you know, you go on the internet and people that are paranoid about black magic and Crowley and all the rest of it are always having a right old go about Jack Parsons taking on the role of the Antichrist. And yet, you know, just look at some of this material and what's in there and what it actually sort of means in the end. It's a libertarian call to freedom, you know, an end to the slave morality, an end to authority that's not based on courage, you know, the authority of lying priests, conniving judges, and an end to conscription and compulsion and regimentation. You know, we can all dig that. He also comes to believe that he had been Simon Magus in a past life. Now again, this is so important in terms of the idea that he's embodying a Gnostic current, that he's part of the Gnostic revival, which is all part of the bigger picture of which the Thelema emerges out of. And he was somebody that had hung around he, at the time of the Acts of the Apostles. He actually features in the Acts of the Apostles. He's almost a rival to Christ and therefore the first Antichrist figure. And he'd been honoured in the time of Claudius, and he'd hung out with this woman who he claimed was the divine female incarnate who'd been trapped in matter during a series of incarnations, and he'd rescued her during her time as a prostitute, but he believed that she'd been Helen of Troy in a previous incarnation and all the rest of it. And he came to rescue her, and he taught philosophy and supposedly had paranormal powers. And this is when he gets grounded. There's a famous magical duel that involves him basically taking on one of the apostles and being brought down, the Apostle Peter, after he's levitated. Now, what the hell's going on in a situation like that? You know, in recent years, having seen the antics of street magicians like Dynamo and Troy doing some pretty interesting levitations in the middle of crowds of people, who knows? But Simon is grounded and he's trashed. And we've got, you know, a record of a lot of writings from this period. Freedom is a two-edged sword. If you haven't read it, it's not so much a book about magic, it's a call to freedom, in the sense that the other side of that sword is responsibility. And this kind of takes us up to round about 1950. And it's in 1950 that it finally becomes official Catholic doctrine that the Virgin Mary ascended bodily into heaven. And Jung made quite a lot about that it was extremely important. So what you've got, you know, the Virgin Mary has returned, if you like, to a space that she occupies in the Book of Revelations, where she faces off the whore of Babylon. Now, in my opinion, the two great female figures in the Book of Revelation, they're presented as separate, but ultimately they're not separate. They come from an original unity that has been disastrously fragmented in the Western psyche. And this whole business of them being set up again through the Babalon Working, through the Assumption doctrine being considered now, you know, official in the Catholic Church. Something in the collective unconscious is stirring in terms of the archetype of the divine feminine. So, you know, Jack and Marjorie have done their thing in that respect. But Ron, you know, this is amazing stories, May 1950. You can just see down there in the bottom left-hand corner. This is the first we hear of Dianetics, and it's not long before the book comes out, and it's a flipping sensation, and Ron is gigging with it, he's demonstrating the techniques to loads of people, and yet there's, in the midst of his great triumph, there is also a bit of Babalon working karma coming back on him, because a real weird scene develops with Betty, who he's run off with. They've had a kid together. Ron's run away with the child. He's tried to control Betty. She's fought back. She's put stuff out in the press that he's stark raving mad and all the rest of it. And it hits him. 1 year after Dianetics comes out, all of this stuff is there. And I showed you the photo where she's been photoshopped out. Although he was married to her, he always completely denied that he ever had been, and completely downplayed her, and checked out their child together years later, only in order to make sure that she was shut up and everything, and that she wasn't going to make too much of a fuss about stuff. Here's the terrible scene where Hubbard's flame of life has become, eerily prophetic, when on June the 17th, 1952, Jack's killed in an explosion in his house. Now, I made quite a big deal about showing all of those posters for those gangster movies. And I told you about the fact that he testified in court in a trial where somebody went down for an attempt to kill somebody with an explosive device in their car. Well, there are all sorts of stories about what happened with Jack's death. He was apparently going to go off to Israel and help them with rocket science. Maybe he was just pretty goddamn stupid and made a mistake there. Apparently there was enough explosives in his house to sort of blow the entire block up. But in keeping with how things were in those days, the guy who went down, the guy whose testimony he put in prison, had been released shortly before this happened. In my opinion, if it wasn't an accident, if it was murder, if it was some kind of crime committed, that is highly likely to be a compelling explanation in that. Now, are we having a word from our sponsors? It's 1:15. I think Seth was going to say something. It looks like he's not even actually here right now, so I'm going to carry on until he's ready to step up and say whatever he's going to say. This is Cameron's amazing artwork, Parsons as a Black Angel. Obviously she's devastated by his death. They were going away to Mexico together. She's just gone off somewhere and heard this big explosion. She settles into her artwork, depicting Jack, and her artwork coming more and more into the light of day now. It's not been seen that much until, say, the last 5 or 10 years, and we're now getting to see the extraordinary quality of it. And this famous picture, this was displayed, this is of a peyote vision, where she's been sexually possessed by some entity, and this was displayed in a gallery, and the police turned up. I think this was in the mid-50s. A lot of controversy about that. And here's a kind of holy guardian angel vision, which I think is quite striking and effective. But most of us, if we've got a visual on Marjorie Cameron, it's coming from Kenneth Anger's inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. And I can only say, if you've got a Blu-ray player and you haven't got hold of this on Blu-ray yet, do yourself a favour. It is absolutely and utterly flipping awesome. This imagery certainly had a deep effect on me. I feature this depiction of her on the cover of Aleister Crowley and the Inner Horus, as painted by Yuri Leach, who's in the room with us, I think. The imagery completely fits the bill. She is depicting Babalon and also Crowley in this remarkable stuff. And there's also recently surfaced Wormwood Star, which is Curtis Harrington's film on the subject, which you can find that on YouTube, I think, in its entirety. That's well worth having a look at. And she features in an extraordinary movie called Night Tide, which you can also find in its entirety on YouTube. She hardly says anything. It's notable for an appearance by an incredibly young Dennis Hopper. It's a most interesting little movie. So Cameron has come to believe that she is Babylon incarnate. It's absolutely clear from Jack Parsons' writing that he never thought that. He still thought that Babylon remained to incarnate. So it's difficult to get a handle on that. Again, the sense of, was the Babylon Working a failure? She came to believe that the hippies of 1967, 20 odd years on from the Babylon Working, 21 years on, that there was like an inner plane baby or in mass consciousness, and that the Summer of Love in 67 was part of the manifestation of that. Obviously debatable, but it's a very interesting idea. Ron, goes on to found the Church of Scientology, and by the late 60s he's got the SEAL together, he's got a freaking navy for Christ's sake, and he's on this boat, the Apollo. It's at this period of time that all the weird shit about Xenu starts coming out. Now, I made a point of putting this image up because we've actually got somebody in the audience, I'm not going to point him out, who was actually on this goddamn boat for 3 months with Ron. So it's kind of interesting what comes back at you. It's not very clear, unfortunately. This is the Times in October 1969, and it's at this point that Ron's involvement in the Babylon Working becomes known. There's a whole feature on it in the newspaper, and it forces a response from the Church of Scientology, which is almost certainly written by Ron himself. And this is a statement. Hubbard broke up black magic in America. Dr. Jack Parsons of Pasadena, California, was America's #1 solid fuel rocket expert. He was involved with the infamous English black magician Aleister Crowley. Crowley ran an organisation called the Order of Templars Orientalists over the world, which had savage and bestial rites. We love it. Dr. Parsons was head of the American branch. Blah, 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 blah. He was living at a place where paying guests were the USA nuclear scientists. Certain agencies objected to nuclear physicists being housed under the same roof. L. Ron Hubbard was still an officer of the US Navy, known as a writer and philosopher, had friends amongst the physicists. He was sent in to handle the situation. He went to live at the house and investigated the black magic rites and the general situation and found them very bad. Basically, the black magic, the house, Hubbard's mission was successful far beyond anyone's expectations. The house was torn down. Hubbard rescued a girl they were using. The black magic group was dispersed and destroyed and never recovered. Well, hey, I think there's a few people that might disagree with that here in the room right now. The physicists included many of the 64 top US scientists who were later declared insecure and dismissed from government service with so much publicity. That statement is the one and only thing, this is 45, 46 years ago, that you will ever get from the Church of Scientology on this subject. And it's kind of intriguing now. I felt, because I've known people that were in Scientology and hung out with Hubbard, some of them at length, and they all said he was absolutely flipping incredible. And I had a feeling that although with all these biographies of Parsons, that the sense of that, the understanding of him is moving on, we're still set in stone with the sense of Ron Hubbard as a pantomime villain who we boo and hiss and jeer at, and our understanding of him just as some kind of nutcase and petty criminal hasn't really gone any further than that. Now, this is a guy called Fletcher Prouty, who's portrayed by Donald Sutherland in Oliver Stone's JFK. When that Barefaced Messiah biography came out, Scientology hired him out to basically have a go at Russell Miller and put a whole bunch of material out there. We've always heard that Ron's stuff about his military career was just a complete load of old bullshit and he's just a total liar, full stop. Now, what's kind of interesting is Prouty, who's got a quite remarkable background in the CIA and so on, he's written this book. The CIA and its allies in control of the United States and the world. It's a whole thing. He had joined up in 1941, worked in the Air Force in the war, and he was in an Air Force division in the 50s working on a system of military support of the clandestine operations of the CIA. So he moved in the highest circles and he retired with quite a collection of medals. It goes without saying that plenty of people say that what I'm about to relate is also a load of old bullshit, but it's interesting that there is even such a take on it, okay? He wrote a long letter to the publisher of Barefaced Messiah. You can find it all over the internet, basically saying that Russell Miller and anybody else that's looked at it, because they haven't come from the inside, do not recognise that Hubbard's military record that we're aware of is just full of indications that he was involved in deep intelligence service at the highest levels. I won't go into all the details, it's all there in my appendix, in my biography. But, you know, there are little things like a congressman writing to President Roosevelt urging him to let Ron Hubbard take up duty as soon as possible, a whole bunch of things that were really quite unusual. The places that he was sent for training, Russell Miller doesn't realise that these are high-level intelligence scenarios. And it's also put out that Ron went rogue because he was hip to all this, what we'd later become MK Ultra, that there was a whole bunch of mind tech in there that was being messed around with, and he went out on his own, and this is part of the background to Dianetics. Now, I know that is very contentious, but the fact that even that a guy who writes a book like this is even willing to say stuff like that is kind of pretty interesting. It's kind of pretty interesting. Now, for those of us that know a bit about Hubbard, you know, in the 60s, once he's got his boat together, this guy is involved fighting off different governments, intelligence agencies. He's sailing the seven seas, dealing with all kinds of espionage. At the same time that he's supposed to be a psychotic, dribbling nutcase coming out of all this mythology about space aliens and Xenu, he is in fact playing the spooks at their own game, and he's doing quite a bloody good job of it. In fact, I don't think, you know, it's clearly something that he knew about. It was clearly a skill set that you don't just spontaneously develop the ability to handle shit like that and to create a huge, great organisation and have, you know, an internal police force, an internal army, and to do all this kind of stuff. There's no other self-help guru or mystical occultist in history that gets anywhere near this. So when it comes to him being a pathological dysfunctional, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can say, yeah, he was, but we've all known pathological dysfunctionals, semi-psychotics, nutcases. Some of us may even have been such characters, but how many could actually handle that level of pressure and function at the same time? Answer, none. So there's something else going on there. And for those people who might look askance at a spiritual movement that involves such activities, the same people might be captivated by the legend of the Knights Templars. You know, a fabulously wealthy organisation that protected and served its esoteric interests with money, espionage and warfare. You know, the devil worship accusations that get thrown against them are seen as vulgar and stupid. People think that they're pretty cool. You know, Scientology still, although maybe irredeemably corrupt, survives. So I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that he really was sent in on an intelligence kind of operation. And yet, he gets stuck right in, doesn't he? He seems to be pretty much into what's going on in the Babalon Working. So there's something else happening as well there. There's a story that Hubbard tells. It's a central part of the mythology. And it's said that in 1938, there's another version that says 1947, which is an interesting date, but the general Scientology version is that he goes to the dentist, he's under, or he's on an operating theatre, and essentially he has an out-of-the-body experience because of the anaesthetic or because he's nearly died. And he goes into space, and he sees an enormous great gate, like something out of Baghdad or ancient China, and the gate opens and there's like some kind of all-purpose knowledge and everything in the universe is on the other side of it, and he goes to the edge of it, he goes through it, everything about where does the world start, what's the meaning of life, and he gets a stonking great download, and he comes back and just, you know, leaps off the operating theatre bed and grabs himself a gallon of coffee and writes the beginning of this legendary book Excalibur, which is so powerful that anybody that even sees it goes insane and kills themselves, so it gets locked away in a vault. Now that sounds like, you know, your typical goddamn wrong bullshit, but in fact there are some interesting little things about this. Some definitely interesting things about this. Now we also know that from the time when he was a glider pilot he had said that if he ever got in trouble, that he saw a red-haired smiling woman on the wing that he called the Empress. Are we getting a service announcement now?
Right, thank you. I'll pop you back over to...
Okay. Right, so just to briefly recap there, during the time that Hubbard's a young daredevil glider pilot, and it really does seem that he was, he talks about a red-haired smiling woman, his guardian angel, who would appear on the wing if he was in trouble, and he called her the Empress. He was quite clear about this. And there's also a very interesting fragment from the early days of Dianetics when he was asked by someone, how come you managed to write that book so quickly? And he says it was almost automatic writing dictated by the Empress. Now, my speculations here were started off by the author of the Montauk Book of the Dead, Peter Moon, who was also in Scientology for a long time and knew Hubbard. And he talks about this gate story, this out-of-the-body experience, and he says, well, you know, Babylon is taken to mean gate, so maybe something's hanging together there. And I actually think that once you think it through, there's something very interesting happening there. We've got our Kabbalah there, and we've got our Golden Dawn, Crowley, Tarot attributions. Between Hotmar and Bynar, right up the top, just above the abyss, we've got the path of Daleth, which is attributed to the tarot card of the Empress. Now, Daleth means doorway. Now, I've chosen the Hermann Heindel depiction of the Empress card because there's not that many depictions where you really get a clear sense of the Daleth doorway. Well, he's quite consciously depicted it right there. And there's this idea that, you know, there's a crossing of the abyss. I know that people, you know, I'm not interested in, is that all bullshit? Is there really an abyss? Does anybody ever cross the abyss? It's about what people would believe in at the time of these experiences. And for Parsons, and certainly for Crowley, the whole idea of the crossing of the abyss is quite a big deal. So there is the abyss, and we know of this Sephiroth called Darth, of which so much is made in the Kenneth Grant scheme of things. And you cross over Darth and you go into the supernal realms of you know, the top Sephiroth. Now, what's happened with this story about Ron? You know, he's had a near-death experience. He's been catapulted through Darth and through the Daleth doorway into the realm of knowledge, understanding and wisdom, and he's come back again. I think that it's not out of the question that when he came to the parsonage and he started brainstorming all the Crowley material that was available to him there, that something may well have clicked in his head and some kind of sense could have been made of his earlier experiences. All that we can really say, even if we absolutely and utterly freaking hate the geezer, is that he accessed some layer of his psyche, some part of his brain that gave him access to extraordinary levels of energy and power. You know, he came back like some sort of magus with an enormous body of work. Even if we hate that body of work and think it's all a load of shite, it's still there and it endures as a thing of pretty considerable power in this world. Something happened to him during the period of Babalon Working, which is by no means normal, and this is all part of the enormous great follow through. Now, we do know, I've got a lot of this in my appendix, which I'm not going to cover, other aspects of occult workings that he was doing after the Babalon Working and before Dianetics. But it's interesting that the waters have been slightly muddied when one of his sons, L. Ron Hubbard Jr., came out of the woodwork in the 80s and started promulgating all this spectacular material. There was a Penthouse interview that he did in June 83. Now, for those of you that have maybe spent too many hours watching the History Channel and various dodgy documentaries about the Nazis and so on, you might have seen a character called Martin Bormann Jr. come out of the woodwork, and he's got all kinds of tales to tell, and he says things about Heinrich Himmler and so on, and I don't believe a goddamn word of any of it. Okay, now I don't you know, I dare say if you were L. Ron Hubbard's son, you would probably have been a bit intense. In fact, you know, we have got someone here who met a number of Ron's children on the boat. Ron Jr. Said, you know, this is pretty much a quote from Penthouse. When Crowley died, Dad decided that he should wear the cloak of the beast and become the most powerful being in the universe. You know, there was no other religion than Satanism in the house. What a lot of people don't realise is that Scientology is black magic that's just spread over a long period. And so my father wouldn't have worshipped anything. You know, he thought he was Satan, he was one with Satan, he had a direct pipeline of communication. Hitler was involved in the same black magic and the same occult practices that my father was, the identical ones that stem back before Egyptian times. It's a very secret thing. Very powerful, very dangerous. Brainwashing is nothing compared to it. The proper term would be soul cracking. It's like cracking open the soul. And then later on, you know, there's a taped interview in 1984. The same individual that transmitted the various magic tech to Adolf Hitler also transmitted them to Dad. And like Dad, Hitler, when he came to power, promptly had his teachers and the occult field in general wiped out. I don't know what to say. But what if you look at the details of the Babalon Working in detail, at one point, Ron Hubbard actually calls in the Archangel Michael via the Empress in guardian capacity. Now, bearing in mind that Archangel Michael is reasonably well known for being God's bouncer and kicking Satan's arse in the Book of Revelation, if you basically want to be Satan, do you call up the Archangel Michael to help you? You know, this sort of thing doesn't quite tie in with Ron Jr.'s estimation of the whole scenario. There's a huge Scientology lecture course series, the Philadelphia Doctorate course, and this dates from 1952, and Ron is actually talking about Crowley, and he refers to him as my very good friend. And he has a little bit to say about Crowley's magic and how it's quite interesting and all the rest of it. And you can find, again, on the internet, you get a couple of minutes worth of Ron actually saying that. You know, he never met Crowley. I'll say, you know, to conclude about Ron, that a student of comparative religion would probably place Scientology in with the Gnostic revival. You know, there are common themes. We are immortal beings trapped in a prison world by a lapse in our awareness that's often caused by external agencies whose purpose is served by keeping us that way. It is possible to awaken, to become free, to regain the full power of our divine potential. In this, I think that there's no doubt that LRH probably absorbed some thelemic Gnostic nuances via Parsons, and you know, maybe with the Nag Hammadi plasmate sort of working its way through. And this all comes to birth in the UFO Cold War 50s and renders Ron's creation unique. But we'll briefly have to get onto this goddamn business, you know, because many of you, if you've come to Jack Parsons, especially if you've come in through Kenneth Grant's books, there is this association with ufology. And it has to be said that after the Babalon Working, Marjorie Cameron did see what we would now call a UFO apparently hovering above the parsonage, and she thought of it as a thelemic war engine, you know, as mentioned, you know, in a particular phraseology in the Book of the Law. But Kenneth Grant said that Jack Parsons opened the portal, and, you know, whatever the hell can be said to be the reality behind the UFO phenomenon came in. I've got a whole section in my book called Multidimensional Mojave. It's kind of weird that where Jack Parsons went out into the desert and channeled Babylon for Liber 49, this is also ground zero for the whole UFO scene in the 50s in America, the contactees. George Adamski, you know, goes out there with what the hell to make of this guy, as his alleged experiences, you know, meeting UFO entities, takes these extremely, you know, notorious, dodgy, flipping photographs of it. I think even though, you know, you can't find any mention of UFOs in Jack Parsons' work, really, and that's kind of interesting because the whole thing kicks off in 1947, so it's quite a few years that he was alive that all this stuff is happening. Due to his involvement with the science fiction crew, due to the fact that he's firing rockets into space, you know, almost into outer space. You know, some of the later rocket work that he does is that the fuel developments were actually went towards the kind of fuel that was used in the space shuttle. You know, Jack Parsons has got a crater on the moon named after him, and there does seem to be this kind of follow-through in terms of what the hell really happened with the Babalon Working. Now, there's a concept Kenneth Grant has, he calls it tangential magic. It's when the outcome of a magical working is not what is clearly stated at the beginning, but in fact later you can see that it is the true will of the individuals concerned. Now, that's a real convenient get-out clause. You know, we did a working, it was a complete fucking mess. It didn't get any of the results, but it was tangential magic, mate, because it was our true will to actually get that result. In this case, I think the ripples off of the Babalon Working are really quite comprehensive. You know, you've got the mystery of what the hell was Ron Hubbard all about, and what the hell did he, what on earth is really behind Scientology. You've got Parsons himself, an incredibly charismatic, extraordinary man. If you read his libertarian writings, if you read his poetry, it's inspiring, it's extraordinary. And he plays out this scenario in this amazing period of time, straight after the bomb has first unleashed itself in this world, at the time when the Nag Hammadi plasmate is stirring, and at the birth of the UFO era. And what we pick up on that now, you know, is all of that together with the kind of the flavour, you know, if you like, also above all of the return of the divine feminine that you get embodied in the very, very distinct, fiercely individual life of Marjorie Cameron, her extraordinary body of art and work, and the iconic charisma. Like I say, if you get yourself a Blu-ray of Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, she's there, man. She's present. You get virtual Darshan off of Marjorie Cameron if you're looking at that. And you know, if you want to explore these themes further, there's a lot of stuff in my book, and I follow it through with an extensive consideration of the roots of ufology and the amount of people involved in that who are full of magic and mysticism. I thank you for being in the room when so much else is going on. I am about for most of the rest of the day. My books are available, and I'm certainly approachable. So, yay to you all.